happy Friday, and I hope you're all enjoying this, really beautiful spring weather that has brought us all here. And it's my total pleasure to kind of welcome us here to the 14th Annual Tagore Lecture. My name is Sarah Besky. I am a faculty member here at Cornell in the ILR School, as well as the director of the South Asia program in the Einaudi Center for International Studies. Before I introduce our speaker today, Aruni Kashyap, I want to offer some brief words about this lecture series and its benefactors. The Rabindranath Tagore lecture series in modern Indian literature is made possible by a gift from the late Cornell professor emeritus Narahari Umanath Prabhu and his wife Sumi Prabhu. Inspired by Rabindranath Tagore's expansive imagination and unbounded geopolitical boundaries, this series has regularly featured prominent writers from across South Asia and its diasporas. So thank you to the Prabhu family for endowing this lecture series and bringing us all here together today. But I'd also like to thank our additional co-sponsors, the departments of both literatures in English and comparative literature have both also sponsored today's lecture. So thank you very much to those departments as well. And so now, our speaker. So Aruni Kashyap is Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing and the Director of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Georgia. Before coming to the University of Georgia, Aruni was Assistant Professor of Creative Writing at Ashoka University in Sonepat, Haryana. Aruni received an MFA in creative writing from Minnesota State University, Mankato, and did his BA and MA in English at St. Stephen's College at the University of Delhi. Here at Delhi, he won the M.M. Bala Poetry Award in both 2007 and 2008. And then later in 2009, Aruni won the Charles Wallace India Trust Scholarship for Creative Writing, which took him to the University of Edinburgh. More recently, however, Aruni's work has been supported with a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts. Aruni's work is truly expansive, spanning fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and translation. He's the author of the 2021 collection of short stories, His Father's Disease, and I wanted to bring for show and tell because I know it's outside, the 2013 novel, The House with a Thousand Stories. He also edited a collection of stories, translating some of them as well, entitled How to Tell the Story of an Insurgency, and that is outside in the foyer, which was published in 2020 by HarperCollins. He has also translated other novels from Assamese into English. The first is The Brown Sword of Tengpakri Teshalar by Indira Goswami, published by Zuban in 2013. And this is a truly wonderful book set in 19th century Assam about a Bodo freedom fighter who was, as the story goes, the first woman revenue collector in British India. So I always have a real soft spot for tantalizing tales from the revenue department. So it's a true favorite of mine. And just recently, in 2013, Penguin published Aruni's translation of My Poems Are Not for Your Ad Campaign by Anuradha Sharma Pujari, a feminist tale of economic liberalization originally published in the late 1990s. He has many other translations as well, including the work of Yeshi Dorji Tongchi, a Sher Dukpan, a writer from Arunachal Pradesh, who wrote in Assamese, as well as translates Deepak Kumar Bakar Khati's work as well. And Aruni also publishes in Assamese, including his 2020 novel Noikon Etya Durot, and 3 novellas as well. So that's just the short stories, the novels, and the translations. And there's really kind of so much more. Aruni's poetry collection, which is also outside, There's No Good Time for Bad News, was published in 2021 by Future Cycle Press and was nominated for the 58th Georgia Author of the Year Award in 2022 and was a finalist for both the Marsh Hawk Press Poetry Prize and the Four Ways Books Levis Award for Poetry. And I'm a real super fan of Aruni's nonfiction as well. And so I really encourage you to look at some of these essays. And I can't go through all of them, but some of my favorites are, and maybe appropriate for this time of year, is Living in Translation, or Why I Love Daffodils, an unpopular post-colonial flower, published by Catapult. And this essay describes the tensions and experiences of writing in both English and Assamese. And for students working in India's Northeast, I now, especially doing field-based or ethnographic work, I now find myself kind of routinely referring them to Aruni's essays, two essays in particular. The first, How to Write About India's Northeast, published in Scroll, and the incredibly moving What the Poet Can Do in the Face of the Modern Colonial State, published in Literary Hub. So essays, short stories, poems, and translations have appeared elsewhere in Bitch Media, the Boston Review, Electric Literature, the Oxford Anthology of Writings from the Northeast, the Kenyon Review, the New York Times, the Guardian, as well as other venues as well. And in his essays and across Aruni's writing, I love the pointedness as well as the snark and the humor. And I love the nuance. Aruni's work is thus a perfect complement to the work that many of us, many of you do here in the South Asia program at Cornell, which affectionately kind of terms itself and self-identifies itself as the center for the margins. And so kind of thinking about margins and marginalization, I think, is an appropriate kind of topic for today. And so I hope that this Tagore lecture is a chance to think more about how we tell stories, how we think about and narrate the lives of people from these so-called or seemingly marginal places. Places like Assam, places like the Northeast, where people and where both people and decades of violence are too often genericized. Especially as kind of the quote-unquote Northeast becomes a site of increased scholarly attention. Aruni's work and all those writing in regional languages and their storytelling in the face of violence, tragedy, the erosion of democracy, and the rise of state repression is as important as it's ever been. So please join me in welcoming Aruni to the South Asia program.
Sarah, my God, that was incredibly detailed and very, very generous introduction. Thank you so much. Yeah, very moving. And thank you so much for all the work that you put in to organize this. Thank you to Gloria. Thank you to Dan for helping me out. I've been treated and pampered so well, and I've been really blown away. So thank you, everyone. And on a Friday evening for coming here. I know that weekends are special and Friday evenings are even more special at the end of the week. So I am deeply grateful that you have chosen to spend your time with me, listening to me. And I hope I'll do justice to your expectations and the incredibly high expectation that Sarah has raised. Thank you. I also would like to thank the South Asian Studies Program, the Now-This Center, and the endowment that has been given by the family for this lecture, the Tagore Lecture on Modern Indian Literature. So it makes this possible. Sarah has said a lot about me, so I'm not going to say anything about myself any longer. But I want to say that I want to begin with an apology because my talk is called tantalizingly Sex, Sedition, and Storytelling. And I know the first word has worked because it was just a marketing ploy. But I would like to, that's the disclaimer I wanted to provide in the very beginning, because most of my talk actually will be about the storytelling, the aspects of storytelling. The three words that loosely unify these ideas I'm going to share today are vital, definitely in understanding my work, but they are connections. They make a connection between what I'm trying to say. In short, these are themes that I have explored in my work because I have been compelled by various state forces as well as social forces. But honestly, the task that I'm most interested in is the last word, storytelling. But seriously, I make sense of the world through stories, and in my case, it is mostly fiction. Even the poems I write are actually fiction. I hope as I share my obsession with storytelling and its efficacies today, it will also provide commentary on democracy, the fragility of the same, and how we can protect it by telling, sharing, and its stories, especially from under-discussed traditions. In the process, I hope I'll be able to outline my work as a writer from such a space where democracy is in peril for a very long time, but conversations, debates, and stories have saved it from falling apart. So I wanted to bring our attention to the dangers of writing fiction, because it is not always a safe thing to do. If we speak about stories and democracy, we must talk about the dangers of writing stories, and I wanted to talk about this by referring to the work of three novelists who mean a lot to me. The autofictional feminist writer Dipti Datta Das, the dissident writer and journalist Parag Kumar Das, and an internationally renowned writer from Assam called Indira Goswami. They all wrote in Assamese, with Parag Kumar Das and Indira Goswami, who is also known as Mauni Roysam Goswami in Assam, occasionally writing in English. But primarily they were known as writers from Assam who used the lens of Assam to look at the world and found wide readership. Each of them also felt it was highly enabling that empowered them, that lens was highly enabling, that empowered them to comment on wider world in a unique way. Hence, they never shielded away from it. Even if Dipti Datta Das, the autofictional feminist writer, was not widely known, for reasons I would outline below, she felt the same way, and the response to her work confirms that looking at the world through this lens was a useful, effective one that threatened the demagogues and the patriarchs, while also it drew applause from serious literary circles. In 1979, the Northeast Indian state of Assam burst into an armed insurgency, demanding to secede. Like other lesser-known insurgencies in the world, this conflict between the Indian state and the rebels, along with the stories people who suffered, went largely unreported for the next 3 decades. Even though there is a wider conversation now, it is on the surface level in the mainstream public imagination. A lot of history books have been written, but not a lot has been written in English. During this period, more than 30,000 people were killed, many more injured, handicapped, killed extrajudicially by the Indian Army. In the early 90s, when Assam was reeling under this insurgency, Assamese writer Dipti Datta Das was so sick that she worried she was nearing death. Her neurological condition, undiagnosed in Assam, had paralyzed her. Amid gun battles and curfews, her husband took her to a city in southern India called Vellore, known for its hospitals. On her hospital bed, she wrote a feminist autofictional work set in Golaghat, which is a small city in Assam. It was titled June Bili Torar Onnanyo, The Sun, the Moon, and the Stars, the rough translation. She wanted to write this novel so that my 2 sons would know what it meant to overcome poverty if I don't live to tell the story. And how she became, through education, by working hard, a professor in Assam's premier college, Cotton College, which is now called the Cotton College State University, by sheer hard work and dedication. You would expect that the novel is in conversation with a long tradition of French and American writers who have written autofiction. Sheila Heti, Ben Lerner, Ocean Vuong, and numerous other French writers simply describe autofiction is a blend between 2 different genres, autobiography and fiction. They're mutually oppositional because they understand truth in different ways. Autobiography is obsessed with precisely what happened. Fiction is a reconstruction of life, and there is no limit to an author's imagination. Both genres, however, want something familiar, arrive at emotional truth through literary techniques. The genre has reached new heights in the hands of writers I mentioned, attracting a broad debate about its possibilities and how it depicts the tension between self and fiction. But autofiction has also been called self-indulgent, even though it opened up spaces for writers to talk about taboo subjects. Dipti Datta Das's work, written in the early 90s, departs from these debates. She didn't know how to read French and didn't read English as well. In a novel, she is interested in the partnership of the self with a collective memory in the tradition of post-colonial writers, where autofiction is not simply a personal enterprise. It embraces broader social responsibilities to correct the long history of historical marginalization. This decolonial conjunction between Western autofiction and post-colonial concerns enriches our understanding of autofiction. Even though Datta Das wasn't making those connections consciously, interestingly, this stylistic marriage of the private and the collective is seen in early African-American women writers experimenting with autofiction, sketches from the life of a free black 1859 by Harriet E. Wilson. Flirting between satire, autobiography, and autofiction, Wilson tells the story of self but skewers her white employers, but never foregoing her responsibility to the collective. This desire to tell a story beyond the confessional and the self is also seen in Ocean Vuong's novel On Earth, We Are Briefly Gorgeous, published in 2019, which invites an autofictional reading while resisting the same. Assamese writer Indira Goswami recounts her experience of living and working through the 1984 pogrom of the Sikh minorities in Delhi with her novels Pages Stained with Blood, which was published in translation in 2002. When Dipti Datta Das's novel was published in 1997, It was a bestseller, and prominent literary critics such as Hiran Gohai wrote to her, and Parag Kumar Bhattacharya reviewed her work, calling it poetic and powerful. Described his critical acclaim, when her publisher sought permission from her to reprint her book, she provided strict instructions not to print her novel anymore. There are only a few existing copies of the novel's first and only edition now. I know all this because Dipti Datta Das was my mother. As a young child, I grew up watching her write this novel and sneaking into her room to read it and later being scolded by her for reading it. After her novel was published in 1997, many people in her life were upset as they were embarrassed by her unflinching account. Her brother, my uncle, never spoke to her again. Many of her male colleagues slut-shamed her for her frankness. Also, a literary scholar, she knew the dangers of writing fiction as a woman. My mother, who loved writing, who wrote since her childhood, she would never write another novel in her life. I wish she was friends with many of the women writers in Europe and the United States who found freedom and liberation in the act of writing autofiction. Parag Kumar Das faced a different kind of danger for writing fiction. Mainly known as a journalist, he is also the author of the iconic Assamese novel Sanglat Fenda, which roughly translates as Revolution's Army, referring to an underground insurgent group modeled on the militant group Alpha, the United Liberation Front of Assam, that was responsible for the armed insurgency that started in 1979. Through a series of disjointed narratives, Parag Kumar Das provides a strong indictment of two kinds of power: state power in its excess, and what happens with people who take up arms against brutal powers. In his book of essays, Swadhinata Prastab, Parag Kumar Das says, the way a war is fought is often determined by the aggressor, and hence he understood the reasons behind why a whole generation left their middle-class comforts and took up arms against the state. The essay collection was written during the horrifying counter-insurgency operations that took place in the early 90s. But juxtaposed with the novel, it takes a new light. The guerrilla fighters or the armed insurgents fighting the injustice of the Indian state starts to mirror the hyper-masculinist, patriarchal, intolerant character of the state forces. This is especially telling in the torture scenes of people who the militant group deem as traitors and carries out death sentences. At the end, the novel is a critique of violence and power, even though it is largely believed due to its contextualization of the insurgency. It was a book that was used by Das to recruit young men into the Alpha organization. Das, like Dipti Datta Das, received another kind of resistance and faced a different kind of danger, death threats. His writings, often critical of the excess of the state forces, made the state forces uncomfortable. His assassination remains unresolved in the courts, which happened in 1997, approximately, I can't remember the name, sorry, a year. Most of the people who were accused of his death are also dead. He remains a popular and iconic writer in Assam, with a new generation of young readers finding courage and determination through his work and renewed belief in the power of the written word to sustain democracy and highlight its cracks as warning. Assam's most widely loved author, who inspired generations of other writers, especially women, was also not safe in the realm of writing fiction. In the early 2000s, Indira Goswami started publishing a novel serially called The Man from Chinnamosta for the pages of an Assamese literary magazine. I was in high school and preparing for my exams and hoping, like thousands of students from the state, to leave Assam for one of the bigger cities of India to pursue a career. Due to decades of insurgency, student migration from Assam, a form of brain drain had become the norm. I eventually came to Delhi in 2004. But during those years, when the novel was serialized, Goswami, who was a central figure in Assam, widely garlanded with national and international awards, had to endure similar kind of dangers of writing fiction from a different group of people, the upper caste Brahmins, who were so upset with her for writing a novel that advocated for the banning of animal sacrifice. Set against the backdrop of the anti-colonial movement, Goswami's novel is the result of deep research of the ancient text written in Sanskrit and provides numerous alternative ways of worshipping the goddess. Wrapped between the doomed love story of Dorothy Brown and a British officer, the animal rights activist Ratnadhar, who harbors romantic feelings for Dorothy, the novel is an impassioned, erudite, well-researched treatise against animal sacrifice. Of course, this doesn't go down well among the upper caste Brahmins who especially managed the Kamakya temple where animal sacrifice is practiced, against which Goswami was writing, it is a 1,000-year-old institution. In fact, previously human beings were sacrificed on the altars of the temple. Goswami received death threats for her work. This is the context within which my writing life began in Assam, and then I moved to Delhi. I continued my writing fully aware of the dangers of writing fiction. I had an autofiction writer at home who had refused to let her novel go into a second print. A novelist was gunned down, Parakumar Das, 5 minutes away from my home, and my favorite novelist had received death threats much before her book was published in print in 2005 and translated in 2006 to English. As a child, I didn't think writing lacked value. I realized early on that writing was dangerous and could kill people, simply because it was important and subversive. And most importantly, I saw myself as an Indian writer, as an Assamese writer, and without thinking much deeply about what those meant. Indian because I was born there, and Assamese because when the Republic Day parade took place in Delhi on 26 January, my whole family clapped when the entourage of Assam appeared on the streets of our small Philips black and white television with a concave lens-like screen. However, I was in for a rude shock in Delhi, as all of these ideas would be shaken into 2004 when I left Assam to study literature at Delhi University. There, as a 17-year-old still writing, I suffered an identity crisis of sorts. That identity crisis is also the story of Indian English writing that enables us to look at Anglophone writing from South Asia in new ways now. The first time someone told me to stop writing about Assam was an editor from whom I wasn't seeking advice nor a book contract. I was around 22 and had started to publish short stories and poems in the online journals that had sprouted due to the spread of the internet. We had met at a literary festival in 2006, one of those grand, glossy, and sometimes garish festivals of books that have these days sprouted across the country, mimicking other literary festivals in India. I was a student and I didn't know I would write a novel and have it published while I was in graduate school. I wanted to write a novel. I had written several of them by then, all failed, not because no one published them, but mainly because as soon as I finished them, I lost interest. It happens to me often. The editor said they would introduce me to an agent and that authors must have one. I was so young that I didn't know what literary agents did and that they even existed. I'm not in the business of policing people who are in the business of books, so I expect the same treatment. See, because you write about Assam and Northeast, you won't be able to progress much in your career. The editor told me unsolicited. That really worried me. I wanted to be a writer and be read and perhaps have a career, whatever it meant for me then at the grand old age of 22. But I was more annoyed by something else, that writing about Assam was seen as a lesser kind of artistic achievement, as if writing set in the place that I called home was not a worthy thing to do. No doubt it was the strangest and the weirdest career tip I had ever received, because I thought the writing about a place I knew so well, about the people I knew so well, would be seen as a kind of intellectual and artistic goal. I didn't know it would be seen as low. And isn't that what often early career writers are asked to do? Write what you know, write what you're familiar with, write from your experience. The editor's remarks might be speaking to the capitalist demands of the market, and they may be right too, but in some ways it also points towards the iffy relationship that I had already mentioned between Assam and India, the iffy relationship that Assam and India shares in the wider public, political, and especially literary imagination. It surely points towards a marginal or liminal position in the grand scheme of India. To be seen as successful, you must prove that you can also write about Bombay or Kolkata or Rajasthan. To be accepted widely, you must also show to the literary world that you can write about Delhi or Kanpur or Sonipat. Writing about a place that has so little space in the wider imagination of a people is a lesser kind of artistic endeavor, less admirable, less marketable, a smaller ambition, and perhaps easy to do. But as I have outlined already, it surely was not easy to do. The person's question was in fact one of the many last straws on the back of the proverbial camel. After studying literature for a few years, I had really started to wonder where I belong in terms of a writerly home. It was also a really complicated time to be an Indian writer in English in many ways. I'm going to outline a few of them. And I think that people who didn't think it was complicated have the privilege to not think that it was complicated. Even though I deeply admired and was inspired by numerous Indian writers in English, Arundhati Roy, Amitabh Ghosh, Jayant Mahapatra, and many more, I started having a fraught relationship with the Indian English writing, the contested space that most writers who wrote in English or were diasporic or both inevitably found themselves in. I felt English writing had failed me in numerous ways, just the way the Indian state had failed me, despite cheering for the entourage in Assam every year on Republic Day, 26th January. For instance, I was often invited to panels on Northeast writing, and as a young person in college, I was thrilled, but I didn't know that it was also a way of exclusion. This was especially true when I was once invited to be part of a literature festival in 2007. It is at this location I attended a beautiful book festival, one of those garish ones, but glossy but beautiful. This was especially true when this was in 2007, if I remember correctly. It is at this location I attended a beautiful book festival. For the first time I met my literary heroes, the Arunachali writer Mamang Dai, amazing poetry, the Naga writer Temsula Au, and several writers I admired who wrote in Indian languages as well. The organizers of the festival had invited me as a student participant, and I would be forever grateful for them for inviting that college student, and to their credit, they fought on behalf of Indian writing from marginal spaces. But what surprised me most was that the entire conference focused on Indian literature in English translation and only Anglophone writers from Northeast India. The main festival, the chief extravaganza, was the day after this conference. Most of the authors who didn't write in English and the ones from Northeast India were not invited to the festival. Dai and Ao, stalwarts in their field, remain excluded from the cooler kids. In hindsight, I don't think it was a bad thing, but as a young person trying to make sense of the world and who had just learned what a literary agent could do, it was concerning for me. It revealed to me further who was the mainstream and who wasn't, who had the poor cousins and how they should be stowed away in the outhouse. The attitude of successive governments in India towards the strife and socio-political instability in Northeast India has been governed by an attitude of language that often describes this cluster as a problem child of India. This infantilization manifests in policy and social attitudes and shapes conversations about literary bodies. Who gets into the palatial mansion and who doesn't? Who gets published, who doesn't? Who gets published and awarded and who doesn't? You can speak, but also you can speak only in someone else's terms. It is also a strange period to be an Indian English writer. On the one hand, Indian writing in English was dominating the world stage with two Booker Prize winners, Kiran Desai in 2006, Arvind Adiga in 2008. My favorite writer, Amitabh Ghosh, was on the shortlist in 2008. I was very angry he didn't win it. The Indian novel in English was a viable commodity. And to the horrors of many of my literary critic friends, I actually mean this as a compliment that it was a viable commodity. Eventually, a writer wants to be read, and I don't care if it is widely loved as a commodity and marketed as one with a sari-clad woman, blurry Taj Mahal, mangoes, bangles, henna-colored hands on covers. Sell the damn novel, I would tell the publishers if I could. And I also not stop talking about the novels and their covers in my post-colonial literature class. I've often quipped in front of my friends and students, if the Western publishers don't keep making fools of themselves through covers of running women wearing trinklets and bangles and close-ups of lotuses and marigolds, what are we going to talk about in our classes and have fun? I don't have a problem with any of those things. As a writer, I was bothered with something else that goes on to the core of this talk, which I mentioned in the beginning. As a fiction writer, how can I be free in the space of fiction when I write? How can I find aesthetic and imaginative sovereignty? I had started to question, do I want to be in this house? Will I benefit more from the fresh air outside IWE or Indian writing in English? Do I want to be part of those debates that all these Indians in Delhi keep fighting over? And most importantly, do I want to write like that? I have tried to find those answers through my fiction by writing it in a certain way that is as free as possible of such pressures and conventions that stifle me. For most of my writing life, I have tried to step outside the confines of the Indian English literary tradition. But why do I do that? What are the artistic benefits of freeing myself from these conventions and expectations? What are the intellectual merits of such a project? I found those answers while writing my first novel, and I still circle back to that reading experience when writing my fiction and revisiting those lessons. And I would like to illustrate those further by talking in detail about my first novel. When I started writing my first novel, The House with a Thousand Stories, I wanted to ponder on the question of artistic and literary sovereignty, the failure of the Indian state for generations of people from Northeast, and subsequently as a writer, the failure of Indian English literature, and in some ways Indian literature too, meant that I wanted to be free from the confines of what these discourses and traditions represented. And since fiction is the only way I meditate, I allowed a novel to show me the way, which became my first novel. The House with a Thousand Stories is set against an under-discussed but essential aspect of Indian democracy that most people didn't know about or didn't want to speak about until my novel was published in 2013. I'm in no way claiming to be the first one to write on this topic, but in both English and Assamese language media, and in some Hindi papers too, I was invited to speak about this context as soon as the novel was published. These public discussions brought back a topic which was often exploited for electoral gains by different political parties to the public memory and highlighted the numerous people who lost their lives during the period. By this time, I did have a literary agent who didn't tell me to stop writing about Assam. I had an editor at Penguin who saw artistic merit in it and valued the story and believed it was doing something different as compared to other Indian English writing. So in the end, it all turned out very well. On the book jacket, he described me as a voice of Northeast. I happily accepted that. I was very young. So what was this historical period? When I was in my teens, one of the most shameful episodes of human rights violations under Indian democracy was unfolding. Throughout high school, I read reports in local Assamese language papers about the discovery of mutilated bodies in lakes and rivers in the state. We heard stories about how masked gunmen visited the homes of certain people at night and picked them up. Their bullet-ridden bodies were found in random places. Sometimes they were never found. In the small rivers of Assam, in streams, in forests, mutilated body parts were discovered that were probably of those victims. For a long time, people couldn't figure out what was happening and were very terrified. But soon, because the local English newspaper's expose, it was revealed that these murders were actually extrajudicial ones conducted by a secret death squad formed by the government of India. The report clearly pointed to the role of government in these killings that claimed it was part of a sinister counter-insurgency operation that was kept under the covers. This episode is known as The Secret Killings of Assam, and my first novel is set against these backdrops. The secret killings remain one of the most shameful underreported chapters of our country. Despite such widespread human rights violations, very little of it was covered by the Indian media and almost none by the international press. It is reminiscent of the Dirty War or the Purge in Indonesia and so on. The book, The Secret Killings of Assam, published by the Nanda Talukdar Foundation, authored by Mrinal Talukdar, Kaushik Dekka, and Utpal Bapujari, discusses these events in horrifying details, perhaps the only English language book published on this topic. But already disappointed by the failure of IWE, I set out several artistic challenges for myself when I worked on this book. My first goal was to find a free space in fiction. Even though this book is set in Assam, I didn't want it to be a book about Assam. In fact, I do not feel flattered when someone tells me they want to learn about Assam and hence have picked up my books. As a literary artist, this is in fact insulting somewhat because I'm not a historian or anyone who is an expert on Assam. Fiction is my mode of inquiry. These pages are stuck. I'm interested in truth, but in the emotional truth, unlike other disciplines. It is true that I wrote this book because of the complete lack of knowledge in the rest of India and the world about the presence of this humanitarian crisis. I was hoping the publication of the book would spark a public conversation about the widespread human rights violations in a forgotten part of India. When stories are published, read and critiqued, in a way, function also as public trials. I was writing to fill up the gaps left by journalism and scholarship. However, this doesn't mean that my fiction is going to help someone understand this very complicated region. My book will hopefully perhaps tell readers what it means to live through violence and survive it, and tell them about the conflicts, to quote William Faulkner, conflicts of the human heart. In fact, what is the value of other research by a person if they don't hear the heartbeats of a person? Reading fiction would enable them to see the same world from a different but emotionally rich perspective. The second challenge for me was to figure out the question of representing violence. I was not interested in mere accurate, vivid depictions of violence, even though this book is about a very violent time and space. This is not a movie where I would represent violence in beautiful, awe-inspiring, hair-raising ways. We also had grown up reading about violence in the papers already, especially the Assamese papers. I had a two-pronged way of dealing with these questions. First, I directed my curiosity to think about fear. I started thinking how, in different ways, fear percolates into the minds of people living under violence and terror, what kind of choices they make due to this fear. What will they do if they have to live under the trauma and duress of relentless fear, insecurity, anxiety, and uncertainty? Will they go mad? Will they fight with each other? How will they be affected by this sense of constant fear? Will they stop going out of their houses? Will they brutalize each other like little children do when they play military? What if fear turns normal, becomes part of daily life, like the morning prayers at the village mosque or a temple? How daily life would that alter the lifestyle worldview of these people? I didn't know. I had no clue. To find these answers, I had to write, and in the process, I discovered. The lessons I found during this meditative process of writing the novel were rewarding, and I continue to execute them. Some of those have been employed in The World of His Father's Disease, my latest short story collection, which is going to be published in an expanded edition later in October here. I would like to mention two of those things that I learned while writing my first novel during the drafting process. How to represent and handle violence. For those who have read the book, they would remember that almost all the violence happens in the background of the book. None of that happens in the foreground. A girl's eyes dilate before she pees yellow urine and faints when she sees the army. Mridul, a character, never walks on the spot in the middle of a road where a mutilated corpse was found years after because it makes him feel scared. And finally, a bride who tries to kill herself not because she's a secret lover or doesn't want to get married, but because she's not interested and is fearful of getting married to a family that may have a member who have joined the insurgency as the secret killings are going on in the background. She worries she would become a victim of the secret killers. The second lesson was how I would handle my anger at the injustice that had gone on. One of the many ways writers handle this is by resorting to dark humor, but in this novel, from the young 17-year-old narrator's perspective, I couldn't have done that. He didn't have a dispassionate and objective response to the violence, plus his own anger blocked me from using humor to handle my anger. But I felt the anger was corroding the drafts. To resolve this issue, I resorted to foreground as much as possible the daily resilience of common people in the village who were reeling under the insurgency. I wanted to write an optimistic book that would look beyond the ugliness of violence. I didn't want to write a bitter, angry story that would thrive on embracing victimhood, because I do not believe that the perennially resilient common people in this book are victims. They are rather winners, survivors. Also, focusing on the anger against the state actors would have centrally placed the state actors in my novel. I wanted to avoid that. In a space where sovereignty is a vexed question, I had to keep the imagination sovereign. I had to erase India out of my book. So what did I learn after seeing the world through my characters in The House with 1,000 Stories? To foreground the daily struggles of common people and highlight how unapologetic consumers of lives they are. To ensure that novels don't become texts that people would pick up to learn history, but to learn about the emotional upheavals of a character or a person. To make sure that fiction is about the small things within the big, large things. The truth in fiction is not the kind of truth that is legally provable, that doesn't shuttle between the binaries of true and false, but only matters if one is able to convey something from the point of view of a character. However, above all, I learned that the sovereignty of a writer's imagination is not the sovereignty from the sedition or to be able to critique tangible, tactile power, but it is the sovereignty of the artistic imagination. Historically, the Indian English writer has been forced to accommodate the presence of a less aware global or Western reader from its inception. An Indian English writer never had the privilege of speaking to the aware, sensitive, informed, industrious reader that a Marathi, Hindi, Tamil, Bangla author had been able to speak to for centuries. It is a kind of reader who deeply penetrates the text to participate in the meaning production. It is an ideal reader, if we can say that. The Indian English writer never had this ideal reader because of the consequences of colonialism. That is because, again and again, the relevance, if not rootedness, of the Indian English writer, especially fiction, has been questioned and debated for a long time. These debates have turned conferences into war zones and cancelled people before cancel culture was a thing. I think almost 2 decades ago, experiencing how IWE had failed me with the editor's question, or by reading the amazing but troubling text of many Indian English writers, I found myself thinking, you guys fight, but please take me out of it. I have a longer, richer literary tradition that goes back to the 5th century, and I will embrace that. They have already accepted me as one for long, and I need to accept it fully as well. The artistic benefits of such a decision was immense, and I'm still reaping those and will continue to in my future books. My attempt to arrive at a language that is free of the dominant gaze, Western gaze, global gaze, colonial gaze, I don't know what you can call it, but that's not my problem, has nothing to do with readership. It has got to do with having an independent literary imagination. I also come from a region that has a fraught relationship with the narrative of the Indian state, as already mentioned. I grew up in the shadow of gun and bomb blast amid heated discussions of political sovereignty of Assam. As an artist, sovereignty for me has to be able to shape sovereign imaginative text, to be able to mold productions that aren't bogged down by the burden of a dominant global and mainland Indian gaze. I'm not sure if my quest to write in a free language has been achieved, but I guess a step has been taken. Maybe one day Indian English authors would be identified by their immediate context, and they would be happy to call themselves Bengali writers who write in English, Marathi writers who write in English, and so on. This would probably lead to a lot of Indian Englishes, but that could only be a good thing for us. It would make us richer. Thank you so much for listening to me. Happy to take any questions that you may have.
We have ample time for questions. Do you want me to use this? Okay. I don't know if it's on. You wanted with the 2013 novel to start a question about human rights and kind of the questions of violence. You wanted to start a kind of a conversation. What kind of conversation did you envision, and was it kind of the conversation that may have unfolded? So to kind of pick up that point that you made.
Yeah, actually my first novel was a romance novel where two people meet at a traffic jam. The Guwahati is legendary for their traffic jams. And I was revising that and then sending it out to different places, and nobody would publish it. But then what happened was that, but I was also deeply troubled by what was happening, because when one of the very famous secret killings cases happened in Guwahati in January 2005, I think, in January 2001 actually. It was the killing of Jyotish Sharma, who was not very far from my house. I was waiting for my school bus. I was stuck in the middle of protest, and I saw the corpse being carried around because the people are refusing to sort of give up. They went to the government office. So when I started writing my book, it was a result of numerous incidents, like the failure of the Assamese novels that nobody wanted to publish. And then I thought, okay, maybe I should write something that's coming to my mind in English. But at the same time, this was a book I completed, and this is a book that got eventually published. But what really bothered me and stopped me from writing a romance novel or a thriller that I often love to read was the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about what was going on during the late 1990s. And I was obsessing about it. I remember somebody once, after the novel was published, what kind of research did you do? And I remember telling the person that I didn't have to do research. Every day was my research. Living through that period was my research. Every day there are reports of people being killed. And I had the English newspapers, and they didn't write anything about it. And this disparity in the two spaces I saw between the English language media and the Assamese language media was really troubling for me. So these are questions that guided me into writing inevitably about the secret killings. In fact, I started writing a novel about a wedding. As you have read the book, it's about a wedding. But the book kept growing and growing and growing, and I realized maybe this is a novella. Then it grew more and more, and I realized I think I'm writing a novel. So I didn't initially set out to write a novel, but when the book was done, the drafting process, I realized that I couldn't write this angry book full of commentary about human rights violations. I have to allow the people and their actions and their emotions and the many events that happen in the village be the commentary about the human rights violations. I simply wanted people to know, otherwise I think people would say that this never happened. A few weeks ago, a poet in Assam, on the day when the Ram Mandir, the Ram temple was inaugurated, he wrote a poem imagining Ram and Sita as a common couple going through inflation and suffering a lot. 21, 22, I don't even remember now, but that many FIRs, first information police reports, were lodged against him across Assam. And all he wrote, I read the poem, was to imagine these two as a couple, Ram and Sita, who was just like trying to make the ends meet, in the middle of inflation. So when I went, why am I saying this story? I went to activist and said, what can we do? And his wife, I called her, and her name is Nafisa Begum, and she said that the poet's name is Nilaf Khorov. He writes in a pen name, and he said that his real name is Rekibuddin Ahmed, but everybody knows that, so I'm not revealing any confidential details. But he said that don't tell anybody about this. We want just a bail to go out. And then there was a bail first, then the second bail got rejected. They had to collect money, raise money from the writers' fraternity, and file a case in the Supreme Court. But when I went to an activist and said, what can we do? She said, first, record this and let me help you publish a report. Otherwise, they will say it never happened. That's why I wanted to write the novel, because nobody can ever tell me 20 years down the line that it never happened. Nobody wrote about it. Where is the proof? That is the main concern. But on hindsight, I can see how the book has remained in the ecosystem and created conversations. And as an academic, I have more further to say. But at that point of time, I was simply wanted to make sure that people knew, and I was bothered by it, and I wanted to show what my family had gone through, and most of the characters are drawn from real life. People say that they are so real because so much of them is real, they really, really faced all of this, that's why. But thankfully the poet is now out on bail, and we are happy he's out on bail.
I'll go. Thank you, Aruni, for the very interesting talk, and it's great to also listen to you, I think, for the first time in this format. I just wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit between the sort of a kind of a side anecdote that you mentioned, and sort of use that to maybe think of some broader questions. So, you did mention at one point that in the initial aftermath of the publication of the first novel, people used to go to you to ask for how and why they should recommend it to know Assam. And you felt that was perhaps a kind of if not an insult, but certainly a kind of, it's kind of a reduction of what you actually wanted to convey.
Yeah.
So just to use that as a kind of a reflection, how do you handle the very slippery relationship between the kind of literary imagination that you're talking about and the logic of location that you use to actually think about that? In other words, how do you handle this duality between the sovereignty that you're talking about and a slippery slope towards indigeneity? Or one could even call it primordialism. I mean, this is a very old debate in area studies, right? So, something that one essentializes. So as somebody who writes in this sort of historical angst, because you don't want what you call IWE as this sort of structural kind of stranglehold. How do you negotiate this slippery slope? Because it can easily go in either direction. And I absolutely understand why you were insulted, and I think it comes partially from trying to resist this sort of pigeonholing into this kind of essential spokesperson for this location. How do you, how do you handle this
Absolutely, that's a brilliant question, and I love the question. I think one of the ways I handle it is by stepping back from the draft multiple times when I write and see if it has details that may be misconstrued as history or ethnography, because I want to step away from it as much as possible. Of course, I cannot deny the fact that there are, for example, if I'm writing about a wedding scene, there will be a lot of cultural elements to specify those and highlight those, because a wedding is not incomplete without that. But at the same time, I also try to do that in the drafting process as much as possible, that novel is not trying to inform anybody of history. Novel is not trying to inform anybody of culture and ethnography. Accidentally, if it comes in, I allow that to stay, but I always let the story be taken forward by the characters and what they want and what are the obstacles in front of them. And as the obstacles rise and rise and rise, the stakes are higher, and that creates the drama. So I focus on the drama, I focus on what they want, and I focus on their emotional reads. And I feel that goes back to the point about conflict of the human heart. The other way is that actually this is a problem that most writers from marginal locations face, where their fiction or their poetry is often read through these curiosities. It is ironical. It is an ironical problem also, because we all know how a lot of writers who are from minority backgrounds, they first made into the academia. Their works were read at first in ethnic studies programs and the first or in area studies programs. So I feel that there's a huge debt to area studies, social sciences, humanities, where these writers have been able to come to the forefront of the academic public and generate a lot of discussion. But repeatedly, I have seen that one of the ways one can resist that is actually by talking a lot about it, by which I mean is that not all writers have to talk about their fiction, have to write about their fiction, and have to participate in the meaning production and engineer the discourse around their fiction, especially writers from underrepresented, under-discussed literary traditions, or people who are writing about complicated political and social issues have to do that. And I actually was talking about this to some of the graduate students in the afternoon, and I always give the example of Godimer and Coetzee. He had the privilege of setting his work in South Africa, but never really naming it also. Like, for example, Life and Times of Michael K., but it is definitely about South Africa, or people can say it's an imaginary country. But Godimer not only wrote very strong critical realist mode, but also constantly gave lectures, talked about it. This is how you should read my fiction. This is how you should approach it. She constantly also said that whatever non-fiction she wrote, whatever essays she wrote, they were not true. She said, nothing is as true as my fiction. So go and read the fiction again and again and again. And her discourse, the essay writings, the non-fiction, her lectures, all of those helped us understand, and she really took an active part in shaping the discourse. Another great example is obviously Toni Morrison. All her novels have a critical introduction. She will tell you, this is how you should read my novel. And she says that in her introduction, she says that in her interviews. They're not about, I sat down and wrote like most other writers, do. They're not about the day what kind of day she was having. She's going to tell you, this is exactly what she was thinking. This is the research that has gone in. This is the thinking. It's a very extremely self-conscious artist, especially her introduction to Beloved and Sula are incredible treatises in how to write good fiction that is both political, rooted, and at the same time beautiful novels that are about people and their problems. As the great American contemporary writer who I think is great, Terry Jones says, people and their problems is the mainstay of fiction. a lot of her novels are about Atlanta. Yeah. Well.
Just to kind of continue this conversation, I'm thinking about, you were talking about gaps in scholarship and your, imaginative sovereignty, and I'm thinking about perhaps the idea that part of the gap in scholarship is in methods or in, epistemology, and as fiction, not critical work on fiction, but fiction itself as being contributing to a scholarly discourse, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think fiction always contributes to scholarly discourse. I think literary theory is a result of practicing writers. It's not the other way around, and many people tend to forget that actually. Yeah, and I agree with you what you said, good quality fiction and definitely leads to good quality academic discourse. And we also need to think about, people do think, but I think it's more of a conversation in creative writing programs in English departments, that the fiction itself is a research, right? The translation itself is a research. The introduction to a translation itself is a research. It's a different kind of writing. It's a different way of modality of writing, but they are research products. Yeah.
I had a question about, I guess, the complexity of writing about violence in that context. I'm thinking about Palestine, and what I've noticed is that there's been quite a bit of a shift, like even from 20 years ago, like the conversation and how people talked about violence and the use of violence for liberatory movements. And I'm wondering how in your writing you struggle with, there's like a kind of moral kind of way of talking about violence, right? Violence is bad, never use violence. And then, I'm sure in your context, it's like the conversation about violence is a bit more complicated than that. And I'm wondering how you kind of navigate that, where there's generally there's like a liberal kind of expectation of like, where do you stand on violence? Do you support it or do you condemn it?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you kind of straddle that.
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer lies in actually Sanglat Fenla, the novel that I mentioned during my talk. My friend Indira Goswami also has a great essay about it, how there are these problems in Sanglat Fenla, but at the same time, ironically, it is actually a text that critiques not just the state, but also the people who are fighting the state forces. And because Parag Das is often criticized as an ideologue of the Alpha and someone who glorified violence, but reading the fiction, you see that it is not there. So my answer is that fiction is the mode that allows me to explore all of these aspects and not have a monolithic take on the representation of violence. When I was writing this book, I did not want, for myself, because that's not my taste, gratuitous violence. And there were many such scenes because I read so much about them. And to the extent that some of them are pornographic, they were real, by the way. I read police reports, I read inquiry commission. They were real. I read reports where people talked about picking up fingers and then collecting them and making a hand because those people were killed by the Gupta Ghatoks or the secret killers. But at the same time, I felt that this is going to take away so much from the language, from the daily lives of the people that I'm trying to foreground and how they survive it, how they negotiate it. And their stories should take precedence because it's eventually they are the main protagonists of the story, not how the violence unfolded, but how they're surviving the violence.
I mean, would you want to kind of maybe think a little bit more about, kind of the representation of violence and maybe, so methodologically, you're looking at kind of these police reports, these kind of, kind of textual representations. I mean, like within the editing process, are there kind of ways in which you kind of are thinking about the relationship, right, there, like, how do you kind of continue to bring yourself, right, as you kind of mentioned in your talk, back to the everyday, back to the kind of seeming banalities of that, how do you do that foregrounding and backgrounding?
Yeah, it is primarily done by leaving the work fallow for a while and then going back to it after a few months. Because I don't want the violence to take away the attention. For example, some of the most dramatic things in the book are about during the mourning period why someone had had a meal with oil, you know? Because you're supposed to be fasting and you're supposed to abstain from oil and all kinds of delicious food. And there's a scene that is the most dramatic scene that leads to a lot of quarrel and drama and so on. In fact, to look at it actually, the fear that guides everyone that Pablo is not allowed to go out of the house, the massacre that happens in the village, which he hears about, the girl who faints and pees in fear, and what happened to her is far more violent actually, and far more dramatic, far more impactful. But at the same, that's how I try to negotiate, by keeping it aside and going back to it again over several years, in order to make sure that the people's everyday, the mundanity, the idiosyncrasies of the characters, that take foreground all the time. But at the same time, making sure that the consequences of violence did not get out from the text. The fear, how they negotiate their lives every day, the action of the bride, which is a central crisis in the book, and how she was negotiating that. I did not want the book to shy away, or any of my works, whenever I'm talking about violence, to shy away from the consequences of that, because I do want people to know that they're living a very violent time. I think violence is violent, and we should depict it as violent as possible. And that can be done either by describing violence very clinically. We see that a lot in writers such as Chimamanda Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, or Marlon James, simple, precise descriptions, no poeticized Quentin Tarantino style, you know. But otherwise, the other way of doing it is to show the long-standing effects of violence, how it affects. I think Blue Star is a great example of that. For example, the long-standing effects of the violence on beauty, on standards of self-perception, of what is beautiful, that leads to little girl constantly praying that she would have she would have blue eyes, and that says us so much more about the culture of a country, about media, about the violence on women's psyche, than actually showing actual violence happening in dramatic and sensational ways. Yes.
I don't quite know how to ask my question, so I'm going to.
We can chat.
Yeah, we can chat. I love that.
Yeah.
But I've read a little bit of your work. Sarah introduced me to it.
Thank you.
And I really enjoyed it. And I was so struck by, because I read a lot of Toni Morrison as well, for I think some of the same kind of reasons, because she talks about incomprehensibility so much, and how you make something incomprehensible, how someone who has the other can become comprehensible, right? And so I was so struck by the fact that that becomes, for you, some of your writing, you've written about how she's so central, and today you've talked so much about it, right? And so I'm sort of, so I think part of, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, what's so fascinating, again, my sentences aren't even going to get completed. You're talking about writing in various Indian languages. You've written someplace, in one of your essays, you talked today a little bit about how there's an ideal reader who understands something very particular about the Assamese wedding ceremony, about the grieving piece, right? When I read you in English, that's incomprehensible to me. Somewhere else you've written about how Indian writers in English should always explain everything, right?
Yeah.
Much like they explain the covers. The covers always have to be explained.
Yeah.
And so
The running women are the most wonderful.
yes. And so there is all that. Now, so what's so fascinating, I'm unable to put the thoughts of that, right? The ideal reader, the non-ideal reader, the reader who doesn't comprehend every cultural nuance, with the thoughts of analyzing work in the ways in which you analyze Toni Morrison's work, which is to really make the incomprehensible comprehensible. There's something there between those two sets of thoughts that elude me. Because for me, fiction becomes a way of entering the world of another. So much, right? And yet if I'm never the ideal reader, what happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've tried to answer your question. I think, yeah, but the observations, yeah, no, I have thought about it often because every book and every story, that's a question that, or that's one of those thoughts. I think that it is okay if not everybody has to understand everything, you know. And we were talking about Morrison. She was also misread a lot, actually, in her early days, you know. So, and she was fine with that. She actually wrote those introductions much later. And but what I'm trying to say is that when you read a poet like, say, Derek Walcott, you know, every nuance that he talks about, that we don't understand what's the actual cultural and locational context that he's talking about, but they come across as images to us, for example, and they still enrich our imagination in some ways. Or if when Chinua Achebe says, we would never get really what it means when he says, in the context of an Igbo culture, when a child washes his hands, he can dine with the kings, right? For us, it means that if you put in the effort, you can do. But what the connotations and the permutations and the ripple effects it might have in Igbo culture, in Igbo language, you would never get it. But it's still surprising and beautiful and vivid to us, and he has been able to convey us that. So I'm not saying that we are not ideal readers, but I'm just saying that somebody who understands everything obviously is the ideal reader, but probably even that is not going to be possible. I was telling a very interesting incident in the afternoon to some of the students who came. At the last stage of my editing of my book, somebody pointed out that there's a fan on in a scene, and I was talking about a scene in a rural Assam in the end of March or beginning of April. And I said, you have an Assamese editor. And they said, how did you know? Because in Assamese households, you don't switch on the fan until April 15th or 14th, the first day of Bohag. So it's a very cultural superstition, actually, that it'll bring bad luck. So and then all this while I thought my editor, who understood the book, fought for it, edited it, was the ideal reader, you know? So I think maybe I'm trying to say, as I'm chatting with you now, that the ideal reader is slippery. There is no one single ideal reader. And it could be anybody who is ready to do the hard work to access the knowledge in your book.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So one kind of conversation we were having is like we talked in the morning as well about like living with the everyday and the violence and then how that's juxtaposed in the book when like the pole incident that we talked about and all of that and then how the heaviness kind of remains. But what I was also thinking about like reading your work and at that point in time was also living with the resistance as well and how a Band is celebrated or Band is observed. Where you talk about how Guwahati, the Band is observed as like okay, it's a holiday. Because that's how for school was also like, okay, Monday is going to be a holiday, so it's okay if you don't do homework because there will be a Band. Like it was like that was the understanding that we as kids also had with that like whatever. There'll be a holiday, don't worry type of thing. And then but then in the village there's also when in the road there's also that there's agitation that's happening. So one is of course talking about the everyday and living and surviving the violence, but also living in the resistance in terms of the quarrel that the mother and the father have in terms of like who will join Alpha, who will not. How like Swadhin, like basically Kumar Das's work is that don't, like you said, don't read it because you join Alpha. You always warned about it and things like that. So and then the Republic Day is celebrated while you watch it, but also then schools don't function, nothing functions, it's a Band. So in terms of how that resistance is observed in the everyday, and is that a conscious kind of, like, because in the book you can kind of see resistance and violence kind of overplaying and underplaying through the characters and how they're talking about it, thinking about it, and if you'd like to maybe walk us through how you kind of think about those things as well.
Yeah, those are great observations about the text. You know, the thing is that I was writing from memory, and this is how it was the everyday like. My biggest challenge was to represent it as loyally and as possible and take out what is unnecessary. But this is how it was. For the Band, it was really a fun day for people who could afford to have good food and have fun. But if you read novels such as Felani by actually Orupa Patange Kolita, which is translated thankfully, you'll see the kind of absolute horror when there is a Band for working class people, because they get to go out, sell those 5 bundles of coriander or whatever they picked up from the road or the riverbed or their back or the 2 gourds. That's what is going to buy their food for the rest of the day. In a novel called Felani is an eponymous character. There's a scene where there's a 72-hour shutdown, and the woman actually loses her sanity, and then she becomes this possessed woman, and people start coming and giving her alms or money because they think she's possessed. In many ways, she saved her family from hunger by getting into that situation, but she really lost her sanity because she was the only working person, sick husband. She didn't know how to survive. So those are things that I saw hugely disparate in the rural spaces or the working class people. And when we live in India, they're all stacked up against each other in this, and we all coexist, right? And we know what is going on, unless you're absolutely cocooned. And I wanted to represent that for some people, it is actually a mode of celebration, but for most people who don't have the middle class comfort like Pablo, or even the villagers, it is not. It is a hopeless situation. They don't want it to happen. The daily wage earners and so on, they are near brink of starvation, because of the shutdowns. And August is the cruelest month, really. It's all kinds of shutdowns, all the time.
I apologize if it's already been kind of contextualized, but I was just thinking through your use of the term sovereignty, especially. I felt like that was such an interesting term to kind of apply in terms of literary sovereignty. And I was thinking about specifically, it seems like the way that you're thinking through it, it is related to certain expectations once you do both when you're kind of submitting, and you were talking about your trajectory with us earlier as well. But also once your book has a readership. And I think I was wondering if you see that that idea of sovereignty as being kind of personal to you, or is it something that could be communal in some way? Is that something that is somehow connected to a vision of communal sovereignty, whether that's community of writers or specifically specific to your region? And I'm also wondering, just because we've talked about the everyday and we've talked about the record keeping that you're talking about, and I was wondering, do you see there being a space for pleasure within that everyday, or within that everyday kind of sovereignty that you're working with? Is there a space for pleasure? Yeah, within the sovereignty.
I think there's a ton of space for pleasure, it is really strange if I say this. A lot of the book, for my first book, which is actually around the wedding and the death, and I spent the first 15 days after the death of my uncle, and it's a huge family. And huge family means more people coming and gathering. Even though everybody was gathered for a tragic event, after 5 days, people are really having a lot of fun. And then it was everybody was playing carom, people are going out here and there. We're all fasting, but at the same time, people just had a lot of fun. They would watch movies together because there was this VCRs during those days. It was a way of gathering together, and even people who were very his son, who is very close to me. We used to go out cycling here and there. And go to the beautiful spots he would show me, and all my cousins would get out. And then there was also, even though people were fasting, there was also incredibly abundance of food. So there was, and in these are, I'm not talking about very wealthy families, so people don't buy an apple every day, for example. So people are just eating those. It was a great time to also gorge on food, even though there was no meals. So there is absolutely a lot of pleasure, but I think also we need to focus on pleasure as much as possible, even in stressful times, which is a mode of resistance, if you can see, or which is a mode of keeping ourselves free also. We cannot let people we hate and dislike, or situations we hate and dislike, have rent-free accommodations all the time in our head. That's the only way we can actually deal with terrible things happening around the world. It's important to be aware of those, but at the same time, be very aware that we are not spending 24 hours thinking about them. This is a mode of resistance as well. Your first question, can you repeat your first question? I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah. I guess I was thinking about just like the use of the term sovereignty,
Yes.
especially. I was just really struck by it, like in this kind of context of like sovereignty as a writer, in the mix of all these like both national and then like international expectations that are coming to you. And I was also just like, I find your final point regarding, perhaps the development of many Indian Englishes might be helpful, right? Like that could actually be generative as opposed to unified, like singular Indian English that has the task of representing all of India to the world. And I think this really reminded me of like Gayatri Gopinath's like idea of a queer regional imaginary, where she's thinking through like the formation of spatiotemporal maps for even people in the diaspora, like to think about their homeland, so to speak, not as the nation, but more as ties to a region. And I guess in that context, but also just as you were kind of talking us through your process or your I guess like your conception of sovereignty, of literary sovereignty, I was thinking about, I was wanting to ask just how do you see your version of sovereignty also being like communal in a way, or is there a way that kind of version could be communal, whether that's through community of writers or like specific to your region, regional community?
I don't think we are free in many aspects all the time. Even when we are in the most privileged spaces, people are not really free. So I think artistic modes or artistic spaces are the space where I am most free, and I want to keep that free. And I'm trying to say that I want to protect that, and I want to nurture that. I want to go towards that as much as possible, where language is the only space where I can be as free as possible. And what kind of a language is it possible? Am I going to be 100% free or 99.9 or 72%? Those are the questions that guide me when I'm writing. And I did not think that it was not just intellectually satisfying, but also I did not think that freedom would be achieved if I aligned myself and tried to write like other Indian English writers. And I found that the parameters to write in the Bengali writers, the Assamese writers, language writers, the Hindi writers, these three languages that I can read in original, who didn't have to explain anything to anybody, and those were the standards and aesthetic entry points and addressal of the narrator especially, that I found was freeing for me. And I didn't have to sit down and pause and explain a lot of the things. So to me, it's very personal, but even in the personal space, it is more imaginative. In the imaginative space, in the writing desk, I want to be free.
That's a really maybe lovely place to end. So, but just I want to say thank you so much.
Thank you.